Hi, everyone, and welcome to The Spiritual Activist. I'm thrilled. I've got an extraordinary panel with me today. I've got Amy Alcini from Recycling Happiness. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Great to have you. David Pagan from Kick-Ass Dad. Welcome, David.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
No hat to tip, I see. Jay Forty from the Greatness Zone. Welcome.
Hey, everybody. Glad to be here.
Thank you so much. And Kelly Marceau from kellymarceau.com. How are you, Kelly?
I'm great. Thanks, Michael.
Beautiful. So we've got an amazing show for you today. We've got a big topic, and this kind of leans more towards the activist side, but there are some spiritual, I guess, pieces or talking points that I think we could get to. It could get a little deeper than maybe we intend, but that's what I like about the show. So what we're talking about today is American values and where we've come and where we stand today with American values versus maybe what our forefathers had intended. Are we there? Are we not there? Are we missing the boat? David, what are your thoughts on that? Blam!
Oh man, we missed the boat big time. We're like the last people on the Titanic. Like, we showed up a little late. We were listening to some violins, and there are no more boats. We're going down with the ship, brother.
So what do you think? What do you think is lacking then? I mean, what do you think were the kind of intentions and versus where? I mean, obviously you say we're missing the boat. How?
Well, I mean, the intentions, I think, the forefathers of this country was, originally freedom, the pursuit of happiness, all that jazz that we wrote down so long ago. But it's, mankind's tendency is to find, loopholes that are advantageous to them, and if it is advantageous to someone even a little bit, despite the discomfort or lack of consideration of somebody else, as long as it benefits them, our inclination has been to go forward with it anyway. So a lot of things have become privatized, and we got corporations making decisions for the country instead of people making decisions for people. So it's kind of gotten out of hand.
Yeah, no, I definitely understand where you're coming from. Kelly, can you kind of share with us what your 2-minute perspective is on where we are versus where you think the forefathers thought we should be?
Well, I mean, ultimately, it's difficult to say, really what exactly they were thinking at the time. What I see today is our values as Americans don't line up with what we think we want. Like, there's this idea of what we think we want, but ultimately we're not doing that. It's kind of like this cognitive dissonance of sorts, where we want things to be great, we want justice, we want all these wonderful things, but ultimately we're not practicing that in our individual lives. It seems like we're more dominated by what we want to have versus like being, or what we really do value. Like, we say we want to value certain things, but ultimately we aren't in alignment with that. We're not doing those things, especially as a government. Our government is not doing those things, and it's kind of sad. There's a huge gap between what we think we want and what we're actually doing, or how we behave.
That's very interesting you say that, because I oftentimes think about the values that humans say that they love. You take a survey of humans and you ask them, compassion, collaboration, understanding, fairness, are these your values? And they say yes. And then you look at like corporate America and you look at politics in these dog-eat-dog worlds, and if you're not shrewd and competitive and willing to chop somebody's legs out, then you're almost look like an outcast in those specific spheres. Amy, you've been visiting Washington, looking at kind of some of these things that are going on. What is your perspective on that?
Well, so far what Kelly and David said both have a lot of resonance for me. Today is actually the last day of Congress. They're going to be out of session now for 5 weeks. And I actually was watching live Congress today. I was watching about an hour or so before I went out and played tennis with my niece and nephew. And then I came back and watched a little more. What they're trying to do today is pass 4 or 5 very important bills that have to do with immigration and have to do with the highway, getting highway funding for, different infrastructure projects and stuff. So it's interesting that it comes to a time like it's literally the last day, and they're trying to push forward to get these things done. So the the speeches today were very impassioned. It's kind of like the last, 10 seconds of a basketball game or whatever. They were very impassioned, and I have to tell you, there was so much bipartisan talk today, meaning the people were really trying to come together and not have this gridlock. I was really inspired listening to Congress today, and typically it's been, they've been getting a bad name. But I feel like that there was here at the last minute some kind of real, coming together of both sides for the best of the American people. And I just think that, so this goes back to the Founding Fathers. Like, we talk about that democracy was actually a spiritual idea. It happens to be our government, but it was born of a spiritual idea that everyone is equal to everyone else. So that's in part why America is so great and seen around the world as a place that people want to be, is because it was really born out of a spiritual idea that we focused our government on. And I was just at the Martin Luther King Memorial, and there was a quote at the memorial I wanted to read. It said, "True peace is not merely the absence of tension; it is the presence of justice." So we think, oh, well, if things aren't going terrible, we're at peace. But that's not what Martin Luther King said. He said if we're not actively working towards peace each day and our activist side, then spiritually we're not really cultivating it. Mm. So I thought that was a really important quote, actually, for our group. I mean, the spiritual activist group. That quote really, for me, spoke to all of us, that this is part of what we're basing our show on. And I wanted to bring that to the group.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Jay, so from your perspective, what is this kind of, what is your vision for what American values should be versus what you see currently, in your neck of the woods?
So one of my favorite books about this kind of stuff, team, is Jacob Needleman's book. It's called The American Soul. And what he says in it is what the imagined intention of what the Founding Fathers had was for the phrase "life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness" wasn't the pursuit of house, car, and the pursuit of money. It was, how could we create a place where you had the ability to self-actualize? What would the government need to put in place for us so that the effort that came from us was our ability to self-realize, to understand the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Pursuit of happiness wasn't how many houses can I get, how many cars can I have. It's how authentic, true, and connected to my real self could I be. So, not that I'm shamelessly plugging the Rhodium Rule, but I'm going to shamelessly plug the Rhodium Rule. I mean, that know yourself, be yourself, help others be themselves was kind of what the thinking of what the American soul indicates, what the Founding Fathers were looking for. Could we have a country that allowed us the protection by government in order to self-realize when that wasn't possible in other places? Mm. And so I think we've moved off the mark, obviously, because I think the shift to house, car, and the pursuit of money seems like it's what it meant with the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And I hear people say that all the time. I have the right to pursue happiness, and for me that means being rich. Well, that's not what they intended. What they intended was your ability to figure out what it is that makes you great, and you should go to your world and do it. And if you make money from it, cool. If you just change the world, that's also cool. And so how do we shift back to a perspective of that was a little bit closer to where, at least in Jacob Needleman's perspective, I just heard that and it really resonated with me because I was trying to get my head around what did that in fact mean. When I heard that, that made great sense to me. That the biggest thing we can do in life is not compare ourselves to our neighbors for what we have, but rather compare ourselves to ourselves about what we could be.
Right, right. Well, it's actually, that's pretty profound, and what I find to be interesting is that kind of misdefinition of happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness has been kind of misconstrued, where maybe it originally meant self-realization, an ability for you to have the things you need, food, shelter, protection. So now you're free to pursue personal happiness or internal happiness instead of constantly trying to chase this idea of freedom, right? You've seen the Chase Bank. They've got a Chase card that says Chase, and on the other side it says freedom. It's like Chase freedom. Well, that's what we've done. It's like we're chasing freedom because we're not looking within to find a way to kind of self-realize and self-actualize. And I find it to be incredibly fascinating, how we've kind of, put ourselves in this consumer-driven culture where it's all about how much we can sell, how much we can consume, versus maybe necessarily how much value we can provide to ourselves and to our neighbors. Kelly, what are your kind of thoughts on what happiness is and how to define that as an American value?
I think happiness is a state of being. I don't think that you need to have. I don't know when humanity or when our culture got so obsessed with having things versus just what it is to be and feel and experience. In some ways, it is. It's a little intense. Like when you think of this consumeristic sort of culture, it almost feels like we're trying to fill up some major hole inside of ourselves with all these things that we think that we need. But spirituality teaches that everything that you need is inside of you, and so I feel like I don't understand why we traded out, being for having things, and I think it's a big issue, and I think it's something that we actually need to, address as a culture, as a society of why do we think that things make us happy? None of the things that we buy, none of the things that we get, we can take with us when we die. We're not going to be thinking about our $50,000 car or our $1 million house or any of those things on our deathbed. We're going to be thinking about our relationships with people, our relationships with ourselves. And in a lot of ways, if you think about it, there's so much stress in this world, and I feel like a lot of it is self-created because people think that they need to keep up with the Joneses, or they need to have this, or they need to have that. But ultimately, when it boils down to it, I think we can all do with less because there's so much inside of us that we haven't even begun to explore. Does anybody know what it means anymore to be a human being and not a human doing, or having, or taking?
That's a great point. That's a great point. Amy, what are your thoughts?
The other day I was walking around this city, Red Bank, where near my brother and my sister-in-law live. I'm visiting them in New Jersey, so I'm getting a different kind of beat of the country and really trying to get out and meet as many people as I can. And I was walking by after lunch down the street, and there was a woman who was advocating for needing money to keep their music program, their strings program, music program going in their school, and that was being eliminated. So, I hear a lot of this in different parts of the country. These things that we say that we value, but we're not putting our resources towards. So that leads me into kind of my point here is going to be that, to show our values is to demonstrate our values, which is also to teach our values, right? So it's if we have values that music's important, that civics is important, and neither are being taught currently in our educational system to our kids. Music is on the decline, and civics is not taught very prevalently, and democracy is a participatory government. That's the definition of a democracy. So if we don't teach our kids to participate in a government that requires our participation, I don't know how it's sustainable, right?
Right.
So it's like when Thomas Jefferson left walking out of signing the Constitution, someone said, do we have a republic yet? And he said, yes, if you can keep it. So he implied that unless we're actively helping with it, then, we don't have a dictatorship. We don't have an oligarchy, although that's what Princeton has said we have now. I mean, that's not what we have intended to have. So I think for me, what hit home about that woman asking for money for the music program is, look, what do we value? Do we value that our children understand music and art and understand the government? If we do, let's put our money where our mouth is. Let's provide. Let's have people elected in our government who advocate that, right? And it's just about electing them in. And then that's about, going out and exercising our right to vote and finding out which candidates do that. Because I promise you, there are hundreds of candidates that want to do that. And it's our responsibility to find out who they are and vote for them. So what I'm saying is I would like to have a more reflective values of the people of America and our elected officials. that's my goal in what I'm doing right now, because I see
appreciate that.
Yeah.
That's a big, hairy, audacious goal. Because it seems like, and when I look at this and I go, my God, from where we should be versus where we are, how do we turn this massive ship around? I mean, is it just in our everyday lives that we begin to, and we talked about this earlier, Kelly brought this up about, we value compassion, understanding, justice, yet we act in shrewdness, competition, and consumption. So how do we begin to kind of redirect the ship? I mean, what is it that I can do on a daily basis? So David, from a Kick-Ass Dad perspective, what can dads out there do on a daily basis to move this needle?
Well, I mean, we've talked about this before, and being able to really affect change by affecting the next generation, right, and reinstilling in them the things that we've lost, or at least the value in the things that we no longer value. And it's absolutely needed. Like Amy was talking about, I mean, the arts have absolutely died in school, you know what I mean? We'd rather teach them to accomplish tasks than to create. So from our perspective, and that's what really got it started for me, is providing that example. I've had to do that for myself first, not attach myself to material things anymore, because I had amassed quite a few things in my day, and none of that stuff really, stuck with my kids at all. It didn't mean that much to them, just like it doesn't in the generation that we have walking around right now, kind of running stuff. We grew up in the '80s and the pursuit of things and having a good time with no regard to the consequences of that. So, I mean, we've gone out, we've started these Kick-Ass Dad meetup groups to emphasize, this is where it's at, this is where it needs to start again. There is something wrong, there's something lacking in our society, and therefore in our country as a whole. So we need to start from the foundation. And to be honest with you, whether or not the rest of us get it, wouldn't prevent the next generation from coming through and changing things. We don't really need all of the adults per se to change anything. We're going to die at some point. So really, and it's kind of a harsh thing to say. I don't really care whether or not the adults get it. You're not going to be here that long. You know what I mean? So for me, the change really gets instilled in our kids, and then we watch that change grow up.
So, and I absolutely agree with what you're saying, and I realize that the adults are not always going to get it, but how do we get it through to the kids? Like, if you don't still get it, how do the kids get it? And so that's my concern, is that we keep passing on generation after generation after generation these kind of little consumers, these little industrialists, when the world has changed, and they're kind of just not, the systems are not changing. Jay, I know you have a strong perspective on this. What say you?
First of all, thank you, David. I'm the old one in the group, so you just wished me off the planet. So thank you.
It's not my wish, Jerry. It's just science.
Oh my God!
Thanks for rushing the science.
That is hilarious.
So I do have a couple of thoughts on this. One, if the older generation is one not worth giving up on, and that's fair to ask if, then so much of the work that I do is in the workplace, and if I am trying to change the culture of an organization, the strongest or the most significant way of doing that is to clearly create what the values of the organization are, and then it's that the senior team model and live those behaviors.
Yeah.
So if there's a lesson anywhere, it would be, how is it that today's leadership understands what it is that it commits to and delivers it? So if there's the possibility of changing that generation, David, and I'll agree with you, there are so many stories playing in our heads about what it is that we're supposed to be and how we're supposed to live and all this stuff, that I would hope that we're not a lost cause, meaning the boomer generation and older, but I don't know that the jury knows the answer to that yet. And part of that, I think, we can see by the nature of who in Congress is voting how. And I think if you start to track, and Amy, this might be a great thing for you to give us some details on, if you were to start to track who are the Gen Xer and the millennials that are working their way into any of the houses of Congress. I mean, if so, in the Senate, in the House, or in any of the other places, what would the younger complexion say, do, think? What values will they espouse? And might that be the beginning of the change? So you know, that's worthy of a discussion at some point.
Yeah.
I will jump on what you have, Dave, and say that if we were to look at the younger generation and understanding that the world can change in one generation, then isn't it worth it to then spend more time with the people who have the most ability to change?
Yeah.
You know, I guess I'm also looking back at the workplace. If you have an employee who just is reluctant to do anything, and you're going to spend more time with that one, or the one who is really interested in being significant. So it could be that maybe we make a commitment that says, for this thing to change, we have to start targeting the juniors and seniors in high school, maybe earlier, and the freshmen in college. I think the linchpin of this whole thing, the change place, are 16, 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds. That's the place, I think, that has the ability of saying, well, what are my values, and how could I have them that are, in fact, different than my parents? And then secondly, if I were to live them, what would they look like, and where would support that? We don't get it supported in school, we don't get it supported in college. So how are we going to introduce some value changes? And I think the beginning of all this, and then I'll be quiet, is what if the definition of college changed? About this is the place where the introduction to what world could be would be, instead of here's yet one more replication of whatever the year before was. I know that's like way out there thinking, but we know college is missing the mark for what it's pretending to do. So what if it were changed as the place where the incubation for the new ideas and the realignment happened, the younger generation taking it on, learning how to build it, and then change it in any way that needed to from the generation before, whatever that is?
That's a big question, right? I mean, we have this group of, and I think this happens every generation, right? So the one generation doesn't necessarily agree with the values of the previous generation, so then they rebel. That rebellion takes a certain amount of years, and they finally come back, and then they end up plugging into the same system that their parents had, yet it's evolved and the world has changed, yet they still don't know who they are. And I think that's where we're sitting in this kind of struggle where we just keep duplicating the same process again and again and again, and then, you know, you've got people like, let's say, for example, Kelly, who is looking to influence that kind of generation. She's had a personal awareness as to some of the things that are going on, and now she's looking to kind of fuse some consciousness into those spheres. So, Kelly, could you kind of share with us what your experience and your feedback has been in doing that and trying to shift values at that demographic?
Well, can I talk about something that's related to everything you guys are talking about first, just for a few seconds? I just had some thoughts. You know, the things that we're talking about, values, we're talking about honesty and integrity, and those are just ideas for the vast majority of people. And it's really hard when our government and our systems are so hypocritical, and we're seeing this, and people are growing up in a world that isn't honest, that isn't integrous. And so we've learned these values, you know, as a result of it. And so basically, like, when we're talking about change, like real change, like how does this happen? It really happens with the individual. I mean, nobody talks about honesty and integrity in school. Like, we learn about all of the wars, we learn about all of this stuff that we don't really need in our lifetimes, but nobody teaches about us emotional intelligence, or what it means to have integrity, or what it means when you do things and have consequences for your actions. Like, when I see young people go to do something and they don't really know, or they don't really think about what they do or why, and they sort of have to, you know, fumble through their experiences like that, in a lot of ways we're setting themselves up to fail. So I think that what this really is just, even in this show or in all of the individual work that we do, it's really asking people questions to get them to align with that, because half of the people in the world don't even think about this kind of stuff. They don't think about their integrity, they don't think about their honesty. They just go through the world like mindlessly, not thinking about much. And then when the government is being hypocritical or not acting with integrity or not acting in alignment with our values, everybody's thinking to themselves, well, who cares? Like, so what? Everyone does it. So I think it comes down to, you know, to personal accountability, and also us holding our government a little bit more responsible for what they do and what they say. And granted, I don't know how the heck we do that, but you know, that's just a thought that I had.
Right. No, I appreciate that. And so, just kind of thank you for kind of wrapping that conversation up. But I still am curious as to what your experience has been, or the reaction from kind of, because you have kind of a mainstream. I mean, you have a kind of a message that is very unique, yet you were able to hit kind of a mainstream audience. How are you finding the reaction of that mainstream audience to this idea of consciousness and kind of redefining values?
Well, I'm having to, in some ways, sort of not be where I am. And in that regard, I'm really meeting people where they are, on these lower levels of on these lower levels where they're trying to understand, or they're beginning to almost open up to what this even means. I feel that with a lot of spiritual types, or a lot of people who have sort of crossed this threshold into higher levels of consciousness, once they do that, they sort of forget about the rest of the world. And when we have like 80% of the world who are operating on lowers of levels of consciousness, and when I say this, I'm talking about anger, greed, like all of these things that corrupt our values, right? Somebody needs to stop being a spiritual type and writing for all the spiritual people who get it, and actually be a spiritual type who's writing to people at their level so that they can understand it. And I'm not perfect at it yet. It's difficult for me, because when I address people at that level, I get these spiritual types coming in, you know, saying like, well, this and this and this and this, and they're completely ignoring the reality that this is a truth for some person. Like, I wrote an article recently about, do you have to be happy alone in order to be happy with someone else? And somebody said that I was writing it just to be controversial, or I was writing it to just have this, you know, this spin-off or this shock jock. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, you call yourself spiritual, and yet you miss the reality that for some people this is very true. They don't want to be alone. And we're not talking about why people don't want to be alone, or that not everybody needs to be alone in order to make somebody else happy. And so I'm actually talking about this dark side that nobody really, or this shadow aspect that nobody really wants to even talk about. People either want to be on one side or the other, and no one wants to talk about the middle path. And so for me, I'm trying to bridge that gap between being somebody who operates at a lower level or higher level of consciousness, and I'm actually evolving myself, but who also can understand that not everybody is there, and there are people that need things explained to them so that they don't feel bad about themselves. Like, the worst thing for most people at lower levels of consciousness is when they hear higher levels, they feel bad about themselves. And it's not productive, and they don't know who to turn to or who to go to. It feels like that gap is huge for them. So I'm trying to bridge that gap in a way that meets people where they are, and I think I'm doing a great job with them, but I'm getting a lot of flack from the people in the spiritual community, and it upsets me, because I feel like, do you guys just completely forget about where you came from, or what?
Because I think, well, and that's a great point. I think we all kind of come from that place, right? I mean, nobody comes into this world with this manual of levels of consciousness. This is something that we completely either stumble onto or begin to experience based on choosing to live from a different states of consciousness, so more compassionate. And just to kind of, you know, the last thing I ever want anybody to think is, you know, when you say higher levels versus lower levels of consciousness, I think what we're talking about here is levels of understanding of kind of the collective consciousness, right? Like how we're all connected, and that everything I do affects somebody else. So I would say that's that higher level of consciousness you're talking about, whereas lower level tend to be divisive and cause us to kind of splinter as
Michael,
humanity.
Actually, that's not what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about lower levels of consciousness, I'm talking about falsehood. I'm talking about the self being trapped in false things, like very ego-based, right? And I had mentioned, like, you know, anger, pride, greed, hatred. All of those things are lower levels of consciousness, and they're false identifications of the ego. Higher levels of consciousness are levels of truth. So when I'm saying that, I'm not trying to, you know, I'm just speaking to a spectrum. And if you want to know what it is,
truth being what's honest and real for you, or truth being this is the way it is for everyone.
No, truth being, you know, courage, you know, just levels of truth in people, virtues, you know. You'd have to look it up online. Like, look up levels of consciousness from Dr. David Green, and you'll understand what I'm talking about. Like, it's an actual map of consciousness. It's an actual scale that talks about our evolution as human beings in a spectrum of consciousness, from the time that we were you know, whatever, small beings to growing. There's an actual chart of consciousness. And so there's certain levels that are higher and there's certain levels that are lower. And just because it's lower doesn't mean that you're bad or whatever. It's just a spectrum that we're talking about.
Right, and that's just what I wanted to clarify, that it's not this good bad thing. Because a lot of times people tend to go, oh, you know, you're talking down to me. Oh, you're on a higher level of consciousness. So now you're talking down to me. And so I just wanted to make sure that we were clarifying that that's not the conversation we're having.
Yeah, I just think. Can I speak to that, Mike?
Yeah.
That it kind of reminds me of like a lot of the conversations we have with Jay, or I know that I've had with Jay, and in speaking to higher levels of consciousness, and it's just that those lower levels of consciousness, like you mentioned, anger and fear, being victims and stuff like that, those are just catabolic states of energy where it's not productive. Nothing productive can come from any of that thought pattern or that energy, as opposed to anabolic stages of energy where you're looking for wins, those truths that, you know, Kelly was alluding to there. And it's just I kind of have the same problem that Kelly does with certain spiritualists, or those that, you know, claim to be spiritual, and they reach this higher level of consciousness where they understand that kind of stuff, and then they kind of take just a spectator's position on the world, and then whenever any issue is raised, and I've seen a lot of the articles that Kelly's written and some of her posts, and then there will be inevitably one of those spiritualists that comes through and says, oh, well, you know, such and, you know, love is an illusion, or this is that, totally missing the point of what we're talking about, because the majority of the world exists, you know, unfortunately, in some of those catabolic stages of energy, so it's very real to them, and they can't see past that. So we need to, I feel, you know, that our obligation as those that understand a higher level of consciousness is to help them see that, hey, there's not that much of a difference between where you are right now and where I am. There isn't this huge chasm between the two of us, right? I realize that now, that there's where I'm at now and where I was before, there's really not that much of a space. It's just an understanding and something that just turned a light on. I still experience all those same emotions. They still exist. For me, it's just a matter of whether or not I choose to respond or react. You know, so now I choose to take a second, and that second gets smaller and smaller, but and then respond from an anabolic state of consciousness, as opposed to a catabolic one where, you know, nothing really gets accomplished.
No, that's great. Thank you for that, David. Jay, did you want to further clarify on that, those kind of levels of consciousness?
Well, I want to bring it back to what today's topic is. I mean, part of why I think, you know, we're misaligned, and I think this speaks to both what Kelly and David were saying, is that as a country we resonate at a really low sense of energy, at a really low spiritual level. That our center of everything we think about is how much more can I get? It's ego-based. That our view isn't larger about what our values are, and is there a way that we could encourage a conversation that is to understand what a higher value system would be, and a commitment to living it, rather than being self-serving and ensuring that it's always the agenda that I have for me. When I talked at the beginning about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and my ability to self-actualize wasn't at the expense of everybody else. It was how not, that's why I said it's kind of like the Rhodium rule. How do I know myself, be myself, but wait a minute, how do I take responsibility that in the values I can step to a higher spiritual viewpoint and say that it is also my responsibility to step up and help others do the same. Everybody should have that ability to live what those values are. So to me, that's between energy and spirituality, if you want to call it that. There are productive ways and ego-focused ones and higher view ones. And I think Kelly was talking about that as we raise our level of understanding about what this is, we naturally raise to higher truths. And if we do, and as we pull everybody to that, everything can change from that. If we stay stuck in the mud on the lower levels, then we find that we have the world that I kind of look at, the one that we have now.
Mike, can I?
Yeah, please, Amy, go ahead.
Good. No, go ahead. I was going to add something after you had followed up.
Go for it.
Okay. What I wanted to say was that what you guys are saying is interesting, and Jay touched on something I wanted mentioned, I actually wrote a letter to, I wrote an article, essay to the Malibu Times, and I had been there for a week or two. I didn't know, and then I came to New Jersey, but they published it. And the article is called The Time Is Now, and it's about the immigration crisis that's going on. And what I talked to about, which is actually very similar to what has come up here, but as Americans, we have a very firm sense of our rights. What are our rights? This is my right. This is her right. What about our obligations? So I bring up the question of obligation. So we're very clear on rights as Americans. I feel like we need to get more clear on our obligations. And I outlined it as it relates to the refugee crisis. And it's interesting how it plays in very well into that. It actually, we really need to be more clear on what our obligations are to solve the crisis at the border with 52,000, now almost 80,000 children at our border. It's not about our right? It's our obligation as Americans. So I think if we think about this a little bit more throughout all the different topics of our lives as Americans, for me, that's helped me get clear on values. Obligations help me get clear on my values as opposed to what my rights are. So I wanted to mention that, and my friend had told me they had published it, and I was happy because the leading article had been an article saying that they were not for immigration or the refugees, and they were talking about sending them back. And there was a lot of talk that day in the Malibu Times about that, and then my opinion article was in the back. And she had just texted me and said it was a nice kind of compliment to the other articles. But I did want to mention that because I think Jay and David and Kelly were touching on that. But I think that's one of the ways I've framed to look at values. Like Jay said, bring it back to what our American values are.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that, and that gets me thinking just about this idea of how mired we seem to all be in, and this is, I'm talking about everybody. Everybody seems to, we have this idea as Americans that we are somehow deserving of the, all of our rights, and, it's like even if we don't work for them, or if we just vote, then we just automatically deserve all the things that we have. And I just wonder at what point in our political discourse, at what point in our American value system do we start to say, no, we do have obligations, to your point. And, Kelly, you brought up a great point about how to get clear on what those states of consciousness look like. I think it was Albert Einstein who said you can't solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it. So if we want to solve the problem of anger, of greed, of all these corporate takers, then we can't come at it from an anger or from a level of anger, greed. So we have to begin to shift our consciousness to those particular values in order to begin to actually create the groundswell that's gonna push the movement forward. I'll place that to David. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I was just actually thinking about an article that I read not too long ago about the millennial generation, which I didn't even realize that was a thing until I read about it. But it's anyone that's reached adulthood around from 2000 forward. And they're actually well poised to being open to a lot of the change that we're talking about. Even though a lot of the things that they do differently than the rest of the previous generations are out of necessity because of the economy, but you find that a lot of them are being less. The research shows that they're less attached to material things. A lot of them, opt out of even having cars, either to go green, or because it's just too expensive and they can't afford it anymore, looking to do different things for entertainment, finding other like-minded individuals, as a whole anyway. Obviously I'm pretty sure that's a little different from region to region, but as a whole, this thought pattern of, hey, what we've been doing isn't working, or at least it doesn't work for me. So I need to find something that works for me, and hey, I can still find this happiness. So I think the idea of finding that those original values is now a little more readily accepted because the way things have been going, it's almost impossible to achieve because of the type of thinking that exists in the previous systems. It's just get, take, me, and all that's done is made a worse situation for these, next generations, which the millennials are still pretty young. So the stuff that we've been doing, they're going to experience for a little while. And they have already expressed, at least in these polls and this research, that they want to bring about change. And again, some of it's just been because out of necessity, because of the economy that we've brought this country to. But I think, and we've mentioned it before in our newsletter that I write, that I think that generation is here, at least being open to the idea that things can be done differently.
Seems to boil this conversation down just a little bit that we've defined this redirection of American values, or at least how we address this issue is we've got to address it with young people. It seems that young people are beginning to understand these issues and take ownership of them, and how we can begin to transition out of this kind of taker mindset or this taker consciousness to more of a compassion-based, understanding-based, giving-based mindset. So for the person who's at home on the couch right now listening to this conversation, and to wrap up, I just want to give you each like a minute just to tell me what's one thing that somebody could do today to begin to bring about this shift. Amy?
Well, I mean, American values is something that we each have to kind of look within and find. I mean, I think the thing about the Gen X generation is that we are kind of in a position here, people born between 1960, early 60s and early 80s, are kind of the ones in position to be the leader, to be in a leadership position. So, like Jay said, we are the ones who maybe have a position of having some kind of leadership on which way this ship turns. So I think it's imperative for that generation, and I actually just read an article on this recently about the Generation X, which it is an important generation because the millennials and people before them are going to look to us as the leaders. And so it is important that we take a look within and develop a really strong set of our values and virtues, because those are the people that are going to be looking to us to what do we think about those things. So that's what I feel like. It's always about going in and figuring out what our values are and how we can move forward for humanity.
That's awesome. Thank you. Kelly, what is your suggestion, madame?
I think that we need to stop pursuing happiness as if it's something to attain. I think part of our consumeristic culture is sort of rooted in that, and have it be more of an extraction of something that's actually already inside of us. Happiness is a state of being that we already have. I mean, people of the past, they had to fight a lot of really crazy, intense things, and so they had to fight against something. But today in America, especially, like, the opportunity to really just be exists. And so, maybe for the person at home, I would say, sit down and write down what your values are, and then write down how in alignment are you actually with your values. And start there, because ultimately the only way that we're going to bring about change is through the individual. And so you have to start with your own basic values before we can even get into anything a little bit higher.
I love that, Kelly. Thank you. Jay?
I'm right on the same bandwagon. I think the action is learn how to be more conscious, and in that consciousness, tune into what it is that's clear for you. What is it that is right for you? What are your sense of values? And then the two, which should be then step up and speak up. I mean, the point is, once you understand what's true for you, it doesn't do any good for you to hold on to it. It requires you to then develop your voice and then bring your voice forward. That's our system of government as well. You have the ability to speak up, but don't speak until you have something important to say, which means go do your work. Right. Understand yourself, show up big to it, and then that's what I mean by step up and then speak up, because you need to be heard, but only once you have done your work and understand what your values are.
That's awesome, Jay. Step up, speak up. That's rad. I like that.
That's great. Thank you, Jay. David?
Why do I always have to follow Jay, man? There's nothing... That's such...
It's not a competition, David. There's brilliant things going on in your brain. Just share some of them.
It is, though, Jay. I've been trying to crush you intellectually for months now.
Well, then it's a one-sided competition because I'm not at one.
No, I would say, for me, I'm a very tactile person. I'm a very social person. And I find that a lot of these values, we're talking about American values, a lot of them involved originally community. And the way our system has evolved, we've become very, very isolated, even in our own neighborhoods. We don't know much about our neighbors to the left and to the right, and I don't think we would be as complacent when things happen to other people if we know those people. If we know that those people are the same, they feel the same things that we do, they experience the same things that we do. So for me, to kind of bring these our values back that we say we value, I think we need to get out there and become more in touch with our community, which really does bring you more in touch with your stuff.
That's
great,
perfect.
David.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And I'll just kind of, I've got a little piece of that too. And for me, one of the things that I recommend people do, and this is something that helps me a lot, is when I'm in public or when I'm in, a place where there's a lot of people, I do a little exercise. And one of the things I do is I say, just like me, all these people have experienced suffering. Just like me, all these people are trying to experience happiness. Just like me, all these people have experienced pain. And so by doing that, it almost connects my consciousness with them and goes, they are no different than me. And so I think oftentimes, and Kelly brought this up earlier about, oftentimes when people, start to see themselves in these different levels of consciousness and they can see a bigger picture, they forget about the people who weren't, and they forget how important compassion is. And so to really connect yourself with those people, now we're in a position to start seeing people as in connection with us, so we're going to make decisions that are based on values that are more consistent with those higher levels of consciousness. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Amazing conversation, amazing panel. Kelly, can you please share with us how we can find you?
I'm at kellymarceau.com.
kellymarceau.com. Thank you. Jay, how can we find you?
You can find Jay at thegreatnesszone.com.
Wonderful. David, how do we find you?
Kickassdad.org. Listen to the podcast, Kickass Dad. Facebook, Kickass Dad. Anything Kickass Dad.
Got it. Trending on Twitter. And Amy, last but not least, how do we find you, love?
Recyclinghappiness.com, and we have started planning for the launch of Politics of Conscience on January 1st. So I have started a Twitter feed. It's Politics Elsini, my Twitter feed, and so we'll be merging that into Recycling Happiness as well.
I love it. Thank you guys so much for your time today. I really appreciate your perspectives, and I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Bye,
Thanks,
guys.
Mike.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Deuces.